Lord's house. We were down in Georgetown at my parents' last weekend for the weekend, so it was good to get away, but we missed you all. It's good to be back, and might have missed this last week. Now you got me for the whole hour today, or most of this hour. But you're stuck with me. It's my turn to do both. If you would, for the devotion, turn to Hebrews chapter 12. And I was thinking about John 3:16 the last couple weeks, and I was up working Loveland or somewhere up there. All those little cities in up north of Cincinnati kind of all run together to me. I don't know usually even know where I'm at, but on the way home one day, I was north of Kings Island coming home, and there was a church. I don't remember what church it was. It was some kind of a Christian church or something. And on their sign it said, "For God so loved the world that He did the unimaginable." And I just started thinking about John 3:16. And we all know the verse, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And I started reading through this chapter again, and I think sometimes we have quoted that, or we know it so well from such a young age that we don't think about it that much. And I started thinking about what that really meant, and thinking about how it was the Son Himself who was saying this to Nicodemus and telling him the Father's love. And that's what this verse is speaking about. It's speaking about the Father's love, God the Father. And I was just thinking about, if you imagined if your only son or your only child came up to you and they had a passion to go help some people somewhere, and they knew that if they went there they could make a difference. And like I said, all analogies, when we try to do these kind of analogies, they always break down. They never really truly can convey the love that God had for us. But imagine that you had a child, and they had a passion to go help somebody, and it was maybe people that you didn't think very much of, and you really didn't know how much of a difference they could really even make. But they thought they could do some good, but they were at an age where they could not go themselves. You had to give the okay. You had to sign off on it for them to go. And I thought about that and imagined what a dilemma that would be, because you would not want, nobody in the right mind would ever want to take your child and sign off on that. Even if they had a passion for it, you would be reluctant to let them go. And when you think about the justice and the righteousness of God the Father, and I know the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all agree. There's no disagreement in them. But if you imagine the justice and the righteousness of God not wanting to send His only Son, the reluctance that would have been. And I know, like I said, that's maybe the wrong way to put it. I don't know if we should think of it that way or not. But I was thinking about it like that. How reluctant we would be to put our child in harm's way, to send them into a battle zone, or send them somewhere where, even if they could make a difference, we would not want to send them to that place. And yet, God the Father loved us that much. But in thinking about that, in those verses, that's God the Son who's talking. And when you think about the passion that He had, now, if you imagine that the Father had that much love for us, that He was willing to give His only Son, imagine the love of the Son. And it's not even mentioned there. We're talking about God the Father loved the world so much that He gave His Son. But that verse is talking about the Father's love. Now imagine how, if it's possible, how even greater the passion of the Son, the passion of Jesus, and the love that He had to come into this world. And so that's where when we come here, I know I've used these verses before, but they always amaze me, how the love of Jesus for us. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, it says, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider Him that endured such contradiction of sinners against Himself, lest ye be weary and faint in your minds." And so, when you think about that, can you imagine the perfect Son of God, as it says there, that He was the author and finisher of our faith, and yet for the joy that was set before Him, He endured the cross. But He endured more than that. Imagine, as it says there in verse 3, that He endured the contradiction of sinners against Himself. For 33 years in this world, He endured living among people as imperfect. As perfect as He was, He endured living among people like us. And when you think about that, the love that it took to come down and live, and when you think about who we are, how imperfect we are, how difficult that must have been just to live among people like us, and yet alone to love us and to die in our place. And so next time you read that verse, think about that. Think about the Father's love in John 3:16, but also think about the Son. And also, too, when you are dealing with others, think about what it would have been like. When we think of others, and we all have people in our lives who are, to put it nicely or to say it in the very least, harsh terms, people that are annoying, people that we find annoying, or people that we have to deal with maybe, and we don't always love dealing with them. Imagine the Son of God, and there was never a person that he came across that in our mind would not have been annoying. Every one of us was imperfect. Every one of us had faults and failures, and yet he lived among us, and he loved us. And so, also too, when next time somebody's annoying you, next time somebody's giving you problems, think about what Jesus had to deal with. There's, as it says in verse 3, consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your mind. And think about what the Father's love, but also in that verse, the implied love of the Son who came and lived among us, endured us, and died for us in our place. And when you think about that, may it cause us to be more kind to others, more willing to put up with other people's issues and problems, and to not be so easily annoyed by others, and to be Jesus. We have an opportunity in those moments when we think about that, when somebody is giving us problems, we have an opportunity in those moments to be Jesus to someone, to stand in his place and to show him his love. Because if you're here and you're saved, you know that love. You know that love personally, and I hope that you're here and that you do know that love. And so with that, we will be dismissed from the devotion and go on into Sunday school. Brother Joey, would you dismiss us, please? All right, if you would turn to Exodus chapter 18. And the first time I ever taught Sunday school, I can't remember now if it was 10 years ago or 11 years ago, but our Sunday school teacher out at First Baptist was going out of town, and for some reason they asked me to teach, and I was, of course, terrified. And they were going through Exodus at the time, and they said I could continue teaching what they had been teaching, or I could pick my own topic, and of course I couldn't really come up with anything. And it just so happened that it was Exodus chapter 18, and I was slightly more terrified than I still am today to be standing up here in front of you. But I don't think I slept much for the last 3 or 4 days before that. But it was Exodus 18, so hopefully I do it better justice this time than I did the last time. Fairly confident that I will, even though that's not necessarily saying that much. But if you will, we'll read the first 12 verses here of Exodus chapter 18. It says, when Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land, and the name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father, said he, was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and did obeisance, and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly he was above them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. All right, so we see here in this chapter, I don't want to get too, well, I'm just going to start here. We see here in this chapter a parallel between the end of the last chapter and the beginning of this. If you recall, I know it's been 2 weeks, but if you recall, the Amalekites came and attacked the children of Israel, and Joshua fought, and surely, I hope you remember the story. I'm sure you were all familiar with it before last week, but we see the Amalekites came and attacked the children of Israel. But in this story, we see another Gentile who is coming, and it's Jethro, it's his father-in-law, who is coming not to attack Israel, but to celebrate God's victories. And for that reason, there's some people who think that this story, and we're going to see in a few minutes, they were already encamped at the Mount of God. They were already at Mount Sinai, which was their ultimate, for now, their ultimate destination, where they were going to meet God. And we're going to get into that in the next few chapters. But a lot of people think this may have happened after they've been encamped there sometime, and that this was inserted, and it's not totally in chronological order, because that God was trying to show this parallel between these two different Gentiles that came to see Moses and the children of Israel. And we saw that the Amalekites came to attack and to try to tear down and try to destroy Israel. But we see here Jethro, who was a Midianite, who, if you read back, the Midianites were actually a branch of, they had come from Abraham, so they were sort of relatives. But we see Jethro came to celebrate God's victories and to see all that God had done for Moses and for the children of Israel. And so we see even here, I think, in this parallel, that God's purpose was not to destroy all the Gentiles. As they are going into the land of Canaan, they're going to meet so much resistance, and there are many of those groups that God specifically wanted them to punish because they were so evil and so wicked. But that was not true of everyone, and it was never true that God wanted to destroy all the Gentiles. We see here a Gentile who is, I believe, a believing Gentile, someone who truly believes in God. And if he wasn't already I know we talked about this back when we first met Jethro back in chapter 2, or in the end of chapter 2 or beginning of chapter 3, and we speculated. It said that he was a priest in Midian, and we were speculating. It doesn't really say if he already knew the Lord and he was a priest of the Most High God, or if he was just a priest of one of the local deities. But we're going to see in this chapter that he confesses the Lord, that he, just like Rahab, you think of some others, there's some other stories as they go into the land. There are these ones in Joshua, Rahab, the harlot, who believed in God and was saved out of Jericho. And so the end goal was never to destroy every Gentile. It wasn't that the people of God are not just Jews, and obviously we know that. But even here in these passages, we're going to see that there are even those of the Gentiles who profess God, who believe in God. And I think Jethro was one of those. He was a Gentile from Midian, and he comes here, and whether or not he was a believer before this is, there's a lot of debate in that. If you study these verses and read the commentaries, there's so much. I listened to several people about this and read commentaries. There's so much different opinion. But whether or not he was a believer before this, I think during this encounter, as we're going to see, he professes the Lord, and he professes that God, as it says there in verse 11, that I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. And when you think about that, part of this was because of the witness of Moses. Moses, as you recall, had lived with him for 40 years. He had given one of his daughters to Moses as a wife. He had helped herd the sheep of Jethro for the 40 years that he was in the wilderness. And so Moses had already been a great witness to him, and so he may have already been saved. We really don't know, and I don't want to speculate too much. But he had been a witness to him for 40 years, and now, after this time when he had told him he had to return and he had to go, God had given him a mission to go and to rescue his people from Pharaoh. Now he has returned, and here again too, as it says there in verse 5, it says Moses was in Jethro came to visit Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the Mount of God. And if you remember, that is where he saw the burning bush. This is where God said, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. You're going to do my work. You're going to bring all my people out, and you will return to this very spot. And so we see here already in the first 18 chapters, some of the promises that God had made to Moses are coming true. He is encamped at the Mount of God. And so he has returned just as the Lord said he would. And Jethro comes to meet him, and he recounts to Jethro everything that the Lord had done in the time that they've been apart. And as it says there in verse 10 and 11, and this is, I believe, if he was not already saved, this is definitely his confession of trusting in the Lord and believing. It says, and Jethro said, there in verse 10 of chapter 18, Jethro said, blessed be the Lord who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. From the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. And when you read that, you think of this faith of Jethro. It seems in many ways to be stronger than all these the Israelites that Moses is leading through the wilderness. His faith is, he sees what the Lord has done. He hears. He wasn't even there to experience it, but he hears what the Lord has done. And we see this absolute faith in the Lord, realizing that God is greater than all the gods, even all the supposed gods of Egypt. And like it says there, in the things, it says, I love that word, it says, in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. So we see here all the pride of Egypt. He understood exactly what was going on. He knew as whoever he was obviously a spiritual man before this, somebody who was religious, and he understood the implications of this and just how powerful it was that God was able to undo the entire Egyptian army, the entire power and force of Pharaoh. And we see here his faith, like I said, seems to be stronger than a lot of the Israelites that had been through this, who had been delivered. And so I think I'll leave that up to you to decide if he was already, when it said that he was a priest in Midian, whether he was a priest of the true and living God, or if this was his point of salvation when he realized who God really was, and after he had seen what God had done for both Moses and the children of Israel. But moving on, we've got to get through this chapter. Verses 1 and 2, it says there that Jethro brought back Moses' wife Zipporah and his two sons, and it never really tells us that he sent them away. At some point, Moses had sent his wife and his kids back. The last time they were mentioned was in chapter 4, when Zipporah had been angry at Moses. The Lord was trying to kill Moses, and probably for the fact that he had not circumcised one of his sons. He had been disobedient, and Zipporah circumcised their younger son and was angry with Moses, called him a bloody husband, if you remember that. And we don't know if, a lot of people who speculate that he sent her back after this because she was angry with him. She did not believe in what he was doing, and so he sent her back and went on by himself. There's also a lot of commentaries who believe that after they arrived in Egypt, I think maybe Moses thought that this was going to be really easy. The Lord was he was going to walk in, demand that the people be let go, and God was going to work it out, and it was going to be a very seamless, quick thing. And when he realized that it wasn't going to be quick, that this was going to be a slower process, then he first hoped that he sent his wife back for her safety, and also just because there was so much going on, and he had to meet with Pharaoh so much and things that after he realized that this was going to be a slower process, that he sent her back. But at any rate, at some point, Moses had sent his wife and his two children back to live with his father-in-law. And so here in verses 1 and 2, we see that he comes back, meets with them, and Jethro brings back his wife and his kids. And there in verse 3, it says, and her two sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I've been an alien in a strange land. And I think these are interesting. These are things that in that period that we studied, and we don't know very much about, but between when he killed the Egyptian and he had to flee Pharaoh and he goes into Midian for 40 years, we really don't know much about that 40 years except that he was married, and then we see the encounter of the burning bush. And in between that, we really don't have much. But we see here that he did have these children, and he named them names that do give us a little insight into how he felt at that time. And I think it's interesting that he was a stranger in a strange land. And it reminded me of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. And I was going to try to quote it, but I saw that Brother Ellis was preaching on faith, and I think it's out of Hebrews, so hopefully I'm not stepping on his sermon. He'll probably yell at me if I am. But that's all right. We can't have too much of the Bible. But 11:13 says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And I think when the writer of Hebrews wrote that verse, he was thinking about that's something that even Moses here confesses. He was a stranger in a strange land, and I think the Lord had to bring him to that point where he realized that his hope. And if you're here in your saved today, don't get too comfortable in this world. I've said that before. I have to tell myself that constantly. Don't get too comfortable in this world. If you don't, at least most of the time, feel like a stranger in a strange land, then we're probably not living by faith like we ought to. And I think it's interesting here, and I think that the writer of Hebrews, when he wrote that, was thinking of this, this idea that Moses, he named his son that. He named his son, and it reminded him every day, I'm sure, that he had been in Egypt, and he had felt at home, perhaps, for the first 40 years of his life, and yet now he was not at home, and he was a stranger in a strange land. And I think anybody who's living by faith, if we are going to really live by faith, we're not going to feel all that at home in this world. And so his first son's name was Gershom, and then the second, and there in verse 4, says Eliezer. It says the name of the other was Eliezer. For the God of my father, he said, was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And I think that's interesting too, because in the original account, when we see what is going on, he kills the Egyptian. We hear that Pharaoh is upset with him and he has to flee. And so it just sounds like maybe he kind of skipped town and it wasn't really all that eventful. But it seems like there's more of a story here. We can only speculate. But when he killed the Egyptian, and he had to flee to Midian, there had to be more of a story here, because we see here it says he must have nearly been caught. It must have been a miracle that he even got out of Egypt, because it says here that he named his son this to remember this time, that he named him Eliezer, for the God of my father was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So it seems like to me there's more there. Obviously, even his escaping Egypt must have been a miracle. He must have known for sure that however he was able to get out, however he escaped, it wasn't just because he got scared and skipped town. He must have narrowly missed being killed by Pharaoh here initially, because he says, the God of my father was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So I think that's interesting. I think that gives us more insight into those 40 years in Midian and that time than he ever gave us in the actual account in the early verses of there in chapter 2 and 3. But for what it's worth, I thought that was interesting, even though it's kind of speculative. But moving on, so we can try to get through the chapter today. Verse 5, as we already mentioned, we see that they were encamped at the Mount of God. So they had arrived at Mount Sinai. And sometimes in the account here it's going to be called Mount Horeb. But either one are both talking about Mount Sinai. And this is where we're going to see for the next many chapters, this is where they're going to stay for a while. This is very important. Everything that's going to happen here is going to be the ultimate focus, really, it's the entire point of the Exodus. It's the entire point of calling them out to make them for God to make them his people, and for them to be his people, I should say. And this is where God is going to meet with them. He's going to meet with them on the mount. He is going to give them the law, not only the Ten Commandments, but even the more extended version of the law. And they're going to stay here for a while, and so they're going to be here for the many of the next chapters that we study. And so they finally arrived, and they are encamped at the Mount of God when Jethro comes to just to kind of give us some perspective of where we are in their journey. And so then moving on to verses 7 and 12, we already read them, and so we won't read them again. But this was a happy reunion. If you notice, Moses, he had a kind greeting toward his father-in-law, and it says he did obeisance. And by this time, Moses was surely more famous, if you will, or more looked upon as being more powerful, but he understood his role, and he understood that he needed to show, as it says, he did obeisance to show he realizes the role that his father-in-law has, and he shows him that honor of being his father-in-law, and he is kind and has a kind greeting toward him and invites him in and is very hospitable. And as they talk, I think especially as Moses recounts what God has done for Israel, we're going to see here their reunion turns into a worship service. And we see there, and we already read verses 10 and 11, where Jethro, his confession, if you will, of how great God is. He realizes how great God is. But there in verse 12, it says, And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices, and Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law. But it says they're before God. I think that's interesting. This time of reunion and this happy time where he was able to recount to him all that God had done turned into kind of a worship service. This was a time where they weren't just talking about old times. They weren't just talking about their friendship. They focused on God here in this situation. And just as Jethro confessed God, all of them, Aaron meets them, and we don't know who exactly offered the burnt offerings, if it was Aaron or Jethro, it's kind of unclear. But they all gathered together, and I thought that was interesting. It says they all ate bread with Moses' father-in-law, and it says before God. And so ending in verse 12, it ends with sacrifices to God, praises to God, and a feast. And it's all focused on giving honor and glory to God, to doing all this in the context of truly worshiping and honoring God. And I thought that was interesting too, that here in all this, it was still, the whole entire thing was focused on the Lord and his great deliverance and how great he was. And there's a lot more there. I kind of skipped through some of that. There's more things we could have said, but I wanted to get through the chapter today because a lot of this is just narrative, and I didn't want to dwell on it too long. We'll begin reading again here in verse 13 of chapter 18. It says, "And it came to pass on the morrow, that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, What is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning unto even? And Moses said unto his father-in-law, Because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Thou wilt surely wear away both thou and this people that is with thee, for this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Hearken now unto my voice. I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, and rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all seasons. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So it shall be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. If thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. So Moses hearkened to all the voice of his father-in-law, and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, rulers of tens. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land." All right, so in these verses, I think it's interesting that we see here that Moses would sit every day. And he had taken one day off. We don't know if this was maybe the Sabbath or something, but he had taken at least one day off to visit with his father-in-law. But the very next day, he's right back at work. And we see here that he would sit every day to instruct the people in God's laws and judge between them in civil matters. And he would sit there all day. And just imagine, the line was so long. As it says there, not only did Moses sit there for the entire day, but the line, these people would stand there in line the entire day. So the line was so long to see Moses that it never ended. It would wrap up one day and it would start the very next day, and it's just people were in line. And when you think about that, he was the only judge of possibly 1 million plus people. And so every grievance, and as I think Matthew Henry pointed out, since it was free, it wasn't like today where you have to hire a lawyer and you're a little more reluctant to bring a matter to court because it's going to cost you something. You better know you're right before you go to court. Here, this was totally free legal advice, if you will. And so imagine how many people would have lined up every grievance between every person. And out here in the wilderness, especially these people, we know how cranky they've been. It probably wouldn't have taken much to want to take one of your neighbors, if you will, in the next 10 over to court for some reason. So he was judging 1 million plus people, and the lines were so long. And I remember, it's not any funnier than it was then, but I remember when I taught this last time, we had been at Kings Island that Saturday before, and my joke was, imagine, you think the lines at Kings Island are long, imagine the lines to see Moses. And, when you're at Kings Island and it says 2-hour wait from this point, I can just imagine a sign where when you're waiting for Moses, say 10-hour wait from this point, or like 14-hour wait, or better come back. There's like a point where it says better just come back in the morning, because this line would have been so long. And when you think about that, though, he was taking all this upon himself. And we see the wisdom of Jethro there in verse 14. As soon as he sees this, nobody else, all these other people that were around him, even Aaron, all these people who would have been around Moses, nobody had ever thought that this was unreasonable, that this was unbearable, that this was not something that could last. But we see the wisdom of Jethro. That very next morning, he comes and as soon as he sees this line, he says, this is untenable. This is not going to work. And I think sometimes we need somebody from the outside looking in. I think those people revered Moses so much that nobody wanted to think about going and seeing anybody but Moses. And so they were willing for him to have to go through this. He was willing to do it. But in the wisdom of Jethro, we see that, from the outside looking in, he instantly noticed that this was a problem, that this was not. And he says there in verse 17, this thing, he's very blunt. He says, this thing is that thou doest is not good. And Jethro realized that this situation was too much for Moses. And basically there in verse 18, he's saying, you're going to kill yourself and you're going to wear the people out too if you keep trying to do this. This was just not a situation that could sustain itself, if you will. And so we see there in verses 19 and 20 and 21 that we just read that he said, why don't you listen to my counsel? You have got to do something. You've got to find men who are able. You've got to find men who are godly is the main thing. He said, men who fear God. And I think that's interesting that he says there. That's one of the priorities for judges is someone who fears God. And so it just reminded me so much of when the apostles did much the same thing when they were beginning to have so much work to do in the church that they weren't able to pray and study and seek the Lord as they should. And so they said, we need deacons. We need people who are able to do that work. And it's much the same in this situation here with Moses in the wilderness. He realized, as Jethro pointed out, that he needed people to help him. He had to have, he needed to start the beginnings of a judicial system, the beginning of a real government to help govern the people. And Jethro said to him, you need to focus on communing with God. You need to be there. And we already know that. We've already seen that throughout this. He is the intercessor. He's the one that goes to God for the people. And he said, you need to focus on that. You need to focus on being the intercessor, going to God, communing with God. And you need to appoint godly men to judge the people. And just as a side note, it's interesting, but hopefully you realize, I would just ask the question, does this system of judicial, does this judicial system remind you of anything? If you think about it, it is exactly how our judicial system is set up. The United States judicial system models this system that Jethro was the first one to propose, and as we're going to see, God allowed it. So, but I thought it was interesting that here, it's verse 21, and he says in verse 21, he says, you need to appoint such men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them. And I think that is so interesting that the most important part of being a judge, and it's still true today. I know it doesn't seem true in our country, and we don't necessarily appoint judges. In fact, it seems like anymore when the judges are appointed, it seems like that's a handicap if they're religious in our society, which is a shame because the most important part of being a judge is that the person fears God. And you think about it, only a person who really fears God, who fears the judgment of God, is going to make fair and impartial judgments because they are going to do the right thing because they fear God themselves. They know that God ultimately will judge every decision that they make and everything that any of us do. And so the most important prerequisite for a judge, and we see it here from Jethro himself, is that a man be someone who fears, or a man or a woman be someone that fears God. And then also too, it's interesting here, even in the wisdom of Jethro, he understood that it would only work if God willed it. I think it's interesting there in verse 23, he says, if thou shalt do this thing, the thing that he's just proposed, this whole judicial system that he's just come up with, he must have been a very wise man. He came up with this whole idea apparently right there on the spot that day. It says, if thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so. So we see here, he knew that even though it was a great idea, it was a brilliant idea, that ultimately it had to be the command of God, that this be enacted, and it had to be in the will of God. And so we see here the wisdom of Jethro and understanding that it would only work if God willed it. And so we see here that ultimately this was put in place, and the verse that we just read, that Moses was able to choose out men and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, and he only judged the hard cases. And so this completely changed the workload, the work that Moses had to do, and he was able to focus more on going to God, being there for the people, being the intercessor, as we already said. And we're a little early, but there's just one other point, because we always want to try this to tie the lesson into Christ and the types of Christ that we see in Moses. But I think before I say that, I think it's important that we realize that even in our church, that we don't want to place too much on our pastor. Everyone here has a job to do, and if we're putting too much on the pastor, if he has to not only focus on studying the word, praying, and delivering the word, but he also has to do more. There's a burden on him to do more above and beyond that we need to think about that. We need to see if there's places that we can help. There's always something for us to do. If you're not doing something, specifically, if you don't have a real clear mission in the church, or at least some kind of a mandate, something that you try to focus on, something that you do, then look for something to do. There's always something to do, and we all have, if you're a member of this body, you are important. You have something that you can be doing and that you should be doing, and sometimes we're doing what we should, and other times we're not doing as much as we could and as much as we should be doing. And so pray in that manner, think about it, and make sure that we are bearing each other's burdens, that we're not putting too much on somebody else, or that we're not letting somebody else do something that we could do, and that we, as it says here, that we don't put too much of a burden. Particularly, that seems like many times it falls to the pastor. So there's always opportunities for us to do more and to take a burden off of the pastor, particularly. But also, just in closing, Moses as a type of Christ, we see almost every week we can compare what Moses is doing, the things that he's doing, and see in him a type of Christ. And I think it's interesting because here we saw Moses as the judge. He was the judge of all the people, and so too Christ. One day when he comes back, he is going to be the judge of everyone. And so Christ, in what he does in his office, everything that any of the people that we see in the Old Testament that live by faith, from Abraham, Moses, King David especially, these ones, they're all types of Christ, but none of them are ever a perfect type of Christ, because only Christ was perfect. And we see here that Moses, he could not bear the weight of these duties. He needed help in judging the people, and it took his father-in-law for him to realize this, but this was never going to work. He was never able to, even though he was the judge, and he was still, God placed him as the highest judge in the land, and people could ultimately appeal to him. He could not do all the work. But when you think about Christ and all the types of Christ, all the types break down when you think of Christ, because the weakness of these types, the weakness of Moses, the inability of him to even judge the children of Israel, and many of the other great men of faith that we see in the Old Testament and women of faith that we see in the Old Testament, they all break down at some point because only Christ was perfect. And Christ is the only one who came here, who came to this earth, came to where we lived. And not only did he die for us, and he bore all of our sins by himself. You think about the things that Christ did by himself. He died for us by himself. He bore every sin by himself. He rose again to show victory over sin, and now he has returned to heaven. And and even as Moses, who was an intercessor but was an imperfect intercessor, Christ has returned to heaven to forever be our intercessor. And one day he will judge every man and woman by himself. And so we see this type of Moses being the judge and unable to keep up with it, unable to keep up with these duties, and he had to delegate some of this duty to other people because he just could not handle it. But Jesus, as that perfect type, one day he will come back. One day you will stand before Jesus, and he will be your perfect judge, and he will judge, and he will not need anyone to delegate that authority to. He has all power and all authority. And so someday he will judge every man and woman here. Every man and woman who has ever lived will be judged at that day by an all-powerful and perfect judge, Jesus Christ. And so with that, you are dismissed. Thank you for your